Overshadowed by the Allied landing in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Soviet Union's Operation Bagration on June 23 is one of the least covered campaigns of World War II. The two massive offensives delivered knockout punches that signaled the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. After halting the German offensive at Kursk in summer 1943, the Red Army permanently seized the strategic initiative. Continuing into spring 1944, the Red Army liberated almost all of the Ukraine on the southern flank of the Eastern Front and similarly pushed back German forces in the north. In the central sector of the front in Belarus, German Army Group Center under command of General Feldmarschall Ernst Busch occupied a large bulge facing east called Belarus Balcony by the Soviet High Command. The exposed balcony presented a tempting target. In May 1944, the High Command of the Soviet Armed Forces, known as Stavka, began planning an ambitious operation to destroy 4 German armies in Belarus, an area of operations roughly the size of the United Kingdom. The operation had as its goal the encirclement and destruction of Army Group Center. Soviet planners anticipated that if the operation succeeded, it would bring Soviet forces to the pre-war western border of the Soviet Union. Army Group Center occupied a strategically important position known as the Smolensk Land Bridge. The strip of land encompassed the territory between the western Dwina and the Dnieper rivers. Anchored at the city of Vitebsk on the western Dwina River and the city of Orsha on the Dnieper River, the land bridge was a historical invasion route to Moscow. 4 German armies defended the 600-mile-long bulge in this area. These armies, from north to south, were General Oberst Georg Hans Reinhardt's 3rd Panzer Army, General Oberst Kurt von Tippelskirch's 4th Army, General Oberst Walter Weiss's 2nd Army, and General of Infantry Hans Jordan's 9th Army. Army Group Center had a total of 38 divisions. The total of the 4 understrength armies came to approximately 500,000 men. The troops were supported by 120 panzers, 450 self-propelled assault guns, and 775 aircraft of Luftflotte 6, 6th Air Fleet. The available panzers units were all assigned to the 4th and 9th Armies. This stripped the 3rd Panzer Army of its armor altogether and left it a Panzer Army in name only. The reason for the scarcity of panzer formations in the Army Group Center was the German High Command's belief that the next major Soviet offensive would target the Ukraine. To counter this potential thrust, the majority of German panzer formations on the Eastern Front were concentrated just west of the Pripyat marshes. These forested wetlands were situated between Belarus and the Ukraine. Army Group Center's precarious position was further exacerbated by German Führer Adolf Hitler's demand not to surrender an inch of conquered territory. Strategically important towns and cities were declared fortresses to shore up porous German defensive lines. Cognizant of his vulnerable position, on May 20, 1944, General Feldmarschall Ernst Busch presented Hitler with 2 plans of proposed withdrawals. The first plan called for a minor withdrawal to the Dnieper River. The alternate plan called for a withdrawal to the Berezina River. This maneuver would have allowed the Army Group Center to shorten the front lines and create much-needed operational reserves. Obsessed with not giving up an inch of conquered territory without a fight, Hitler rejected both proposals out of hand. Furthermore, he ordered the so-called fortress cities of Belarus to be defended to the last man. Operation Bagration was named for General Pyotr Bagration, a hero of Napoleonic Wars. In preparation for the operation, the Red Army massed substantial reserves. Opposing Army Group Center were 4 Soviet Army fronts: the 1st Baltic Front under Lieutenant General Ivan Bagramyan, the 3rd Belarus Front under Colonel General Ivan Cherniakovsky, the 2nd Belarus Front under General Grigory Zakharov, and the 1st Belarus Front under Colonel General Konstantin Rokossovsky. The 4 fronts numbered 1,670,000 men, 33,000 guns and mortars, and 5,800 tanks and self-propelled howitzers. Each army was allocated a tank or mechanized corps to exploit breakthroughs. Separate tank brigades were assigned to support infantry divisions. The objective of the tank brigades was to breach the first line of German defensive positions. 5 Soviet air armies, all of the front-level aviation, and almost all the long-range bombers, totaling 5,300 combat aircraft, provided air support for the offensive. Behind German lines, 140,000 partisans operated under direct control from Moscow. Bitter lessons of the first 3 years of war taught the Soviets how tenacious the Germans were on the defense. In response, the Soviets formed multiple large-caliber artillery corps, each of which consisted of approximately 1,100 artillery pieces ranging from 76 mm to 203 mm guns, as well as the dreaded Katyusha mobile rocket launchers. By 1944, mines, explosive charges, Panzerfausts, and other various short-range weapons to knock them out. Due to generous aid from the United States through the Lend-Lease program, Soviet ground forces fielded large numbers of motorized formations. Indeed, in the first phase of the operation, the Second Belarus Front had orders to pin down the forces of Army Group Center, while the First and Third Belarus Fronts enveloped German frontline forces in wide flanking maneuvers. The two fronts were allocated 2/3 of Soviet reserves, combat vehicles, and equipment marshaled for Operation Bagration. The First Baltic Front was assigned a secondary role of protecting the right flank of the Third Belarus Front and keeping the gap open between German Army Group Center and North. The second phase of Operation Bagration called for the encirclement of German forces west of Minsk, destruction of the main body of Army Group Center, and an advance to the pre-war border. Early in the war, many Soviet military disasters could be directly attributed to poor upper-level command and coordination. This time, the priority that Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin and the Stavka placed on cooperation between the fronts was demonstrated by the rank of the individuals assigned to supervise operations. Stavka appointed Chief of Soviet General Staff Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky to coordinate operations of the First Baltic and Third Belarus fronts, and it appointed Deputy Supreme Commander Marshal Georgy Zhukov to oversee the First and Second Belarus fronts. Deception measures played an important part in Soviet preparations. All efforts were exerted to convince the Germans that the next major Soviet offensive would continue in the Ukraine. Civilian populations were evacuated away from the front lines to minimize the possibility of the Soviet deployments being leaked to the Germans. Frontline Red Army units made a great show of preparing defensive positions. Staff officers overflew Soviet positions to ensure that camouflage measures were observed. Under strict radio silence, units rotated to the rear to practice combined arms tactics. Simultaneously, Soviet command stepped up efforts to acquire tactical and strategic intelligence about German forces facing them. Soviet air reconnaissance efforts, which were for the most part unimpeded by the German Luftwaffe, gathered valuable information in real time. Despite Soviet efforts to conceal their massive preparations for the offensive in early June, German Army Group Center headquarters began receiving alarming reports from ground and air reconnaissance and radio intercepts. Army Group Center staff initially disregarded the warning signs. However, intelligence and reconnaissance reports increased in number and urgency. When Soviet long-range aviation began sustained attacks on German airfields June 12th, German commanders became convinced of an impending major Soviet offensive. Unable to convince Hitler of the threat, Bush took the opportunity on June 19th to fly to Germany on leave. Bush hardly had time to unpack when Soviet partisans began striking at vulnerable objectives that night. They mainly targeted German-controlled railroad junctions, bridges, and other strategic transportation points in the German rear. In some locations, they succeeded in halting all rail traffic. This severely impeded the ability of German units to shift reinforcements and supplies to threatened sectors of the front. On the evening of June 21st, multiple waves of Soviet aircraft began bombing German positions. With the heavy concussions of the bombs masking their work, Soviet combat engineers began clearing passages through German minefields. German sentries picked up on the activity in many locations. At 3 a.m. the following morning, the leading Soviet infantry units, supported by tanks outfitted with mine plows, advanced on the first line of German defenses. The general offensive began as a series of localized encirclement operations. Massive artillery barrages rained down on positions of the 3rd Panzer Army near Vitebsk on the northern end of the Bulge. Forming the northern pincer of the envelopment, infantry units of the First Baltic Front broke through German forward positions. Their strategy was to bypass Vitebsk and attack it from the rear. As Soviet shells rained down on German positions, Bush was advised by telephone of the Soviet offensive. He caught the first available plane and by late afternoon was at his headquarters, greeted by grim news of an endangered left flank and the loss of contact with Army Group North. Despite massive Soviet air and artillery bombardment, German defenders grimly hung onto their positions, and the Soviet infantry was able to achieve only minor penetrations of the forward defenses. Soviet tank brigades alone could not achieve breakthroughs, so Soviet senior commanders deployed their reserve tank corps earlier than they had planned. While the 3rd Panzer Army was being severely tested, the other 3 armies of Army Group Center suffered only limited attacks on June 22nd. The following morning, Soviet heavy guns once again pounded German positions. Afterwards, the 3rd Belarus Front attacked the Section 7 Corps of the German 4th Army, situated east and south of Orsha. The attack formed the southern pincer of the planned envelopment. The Soviet front had orders to capture Orsha and continue to Borisov, southwest of Vitebsk. The German 78th Sturm Division, from the 4th Army, put up a determined resistance at Orsha, but could not stop the Soviet onslaught. The 78th was badly mauled in the battle. Although the first 48 hours was incredibly challenging for German forces, the worst was yet to come. On June 24th, the 43rd Army from the 1st Baltic Front and the 9th Army from the 3rd Belarus Front encircled Vitebsk. The capacity of Soviet forces to carry out swift and efficient attacks came as a shock to the Germans. From the outset of Operation Bagration, Soviet forces exhibited excellent mobility, maintained demanding tempos of operation, and expertly coordinated their forces to achieve breakthroughs. In their attacks, the Red Army forces used a new tactic known as the rolling double barrage. This involved pummeling enemy forward and rear defensive positions simultaneously in order to suppress German anti-tank defenses and break through German lines. Soviet armor often outran effective artillery support during their lightning attacks. When that occurred, Soviet aircraft assumed the role of fire support. German aircraft attempting to slow down advancing Soviet formations had to fight their way through swarms of Soviet fighters, only to run into a dense Soviet network of mobile air defense. German General of Artillery Georg Pfeiffer's 6th Army Corps was split apart southeast of Mogilev and disintegrated after several days of desperate fighting. When Pfeiffer himself was killed in action 4 days later, he was replaced by General of Artillery Helmuth Weidling. In heavy fighting, all of the Corps' division commanders were slain. The survivors of the Corps fled west in small groups. The defenses of General of Artillery Robert Martinek's Panzer Corps collapsed after being struck by 2 Soviet armies near Mogilev. On its right flank, the Theodolin Army Corps sent its last radio message at 2 p.m. After that, nothing more was heard of it. The 37th Army Corps north of Mogilev also was hit hard. Its troops abandoned their positions and retreated north to Orsha. Bush's initial assessment was that his forces could not hold Vitebsk unless his army group received reinforcements. The German High Command, however, was unwilling to detach forces from Army Group North to assist Army Group Center. Elsewhere, Bush strived for a rigid defense in the face of the Soviet blitz, but Army Group Center soon lost all cohesion. Communications between Bush's staff and lower-level headquarters broke down entirely. In a merciless litany of destruction, German divisions and regiments fought for their very survival, without guidance from headquarters, at the beginning of Operation Bagration. On June 24th, Hitler, Army Group Center headquarters, and Lurig Corps Commander General Friedrich Gollwitzer all conferred about the German defense. Hitler, as was usual in the latter stages of the war, had taken personal command of the situation. When the Russians completed their encirclement of Gollwitzer's troops in Vitebsk, Hitler uncharacteristically granted his permission for the remnants of the Lurig Corps to attempt to break out. Gollwitzer and his troops attempted to fight their way out of the encirclement on the morning of June 26th, but it was too late. The ring of Soviet forces surrounding the Lurig Corps was simply too strong. The heavy fighting at Vitebsk ended the following day. Gallwitzer was among the 10,000 Germans from that sector who were marched into captivity. The Russians continued carving up German forces in the Bulge on June 25, 26. Their methodical attacks splintered and destroyed Wehrmacht formations. The few regiments, often only at company strength, had to try to fight their way to the west through the extensive forest and marsh region, wrote Werner Haupt, a German veteran of the Eastern Front. The Soviets pursued throughout, overtaking the German columns, splitting them apart, and destroying them individually. The last transport trains with wounded weapons and equipment had left just before the encirclement of Orsha. However, several kilometers later, 25 trains were overtaken by Soviet tanks and destroyed. After Orsha fell to the Russians on June 26, mobile formations of the Third Belarus Front were sent into the gaps of the crumbling Third Panzer Army. Marshal Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army and Lieutenant General Nikolai Ozlakovsky's task force, which comprised a mechanized corps and a cavalry corps, turned the disordered retreat of the 3rd Panzer Army into a rout. At the same time, the outnumbered Luftflotte 6 fought desperately to continue operations, even though the Wehrmacht could do little to protect its forward airfields. Soviet aircraft bombed and strafed the main road from Vitebsk to Lapel, destroying retreating German forces. The road became a veritable charnel house of bombed-out German equipment and smoldering corpses. Busch flew to Führer headquarters at the Wolfschanze in East Prussia on the 26th of June. He practically begged Hitler to allow him to save the remnants of Army Group Center by withdrawing behind the Dnieper River. Hitler would not hear of it, though. He sacked Busch on June 28th and reassigned him to a remote post in Romania. The Soviet success in the Vitebsk-Orsha operation resulted in the destruction of 2 of the 3 corps of the 3rd Panzer Army. As a result, Army Group Center's left flank ceased to exist, and the road lay open southwest to Borisov and northwest to Polotsk. The Soviets placed a high priority on capturing Polotsk, for German forces operating in that region could threaten the right flank of the First Baltic Front. Without any time to rest and refit, Bagramyan's First Baltic Front advanced on Polotsk using the envelopment tactic, which was working extremely well for Soviet forces seeking to isolate and destroy fortified German positions. Without waiting to be surrounded, Generaloberst Karl Hilpert, the commander of the German garrison at Polotsk, withdrew his men to safety on his own authority. Soviet forces reached Polotsk on the 4th of July and occupied it without a fight, removing the threat to the First Baltic Front's right flank. At Bobruisk, the German 9th Army under General Hans Jordan faced the Soviet 1st Belarus Front, the strongest of the 4 Soviet army groups under General Konstantin Rokossovsky. The most convenient route to Bobruisk was from the southeast. However, the Germans had established a strong position at Perichi, which barred the Soviet path. Colonel General Pavel Batov, commanding the Soviet 65th Army, decided to bypass the German position via a swamp which the Germans considered impassable. German generals trusted a topographical symbol for impassable swamp and succumbed to a conciliatory idea that we would not be able to advance along the swamps, wrote Batov. Russian combat engineers quickly built several corduroy log roads through the wetlands. Although the Germans monitored the swamps, they had no forces deployed in them. During the first day of the advance, the 65th Army penetrated German defenses up to 6 miles. A tank corps followed the infantry to exploit the breach in German lines obtained by marching through the waterlogged terrain. To the north and east of Bobruisk, the Soviet Third Army under Colonel General Gorbatov ran into strong German defenses, reinforced by General Lieutenant Mortimer von Kessel's 20th Panzer Division, Jordan's mobile reserve. The German Panzer Division slowed down the Soviet offensive, but was unable to prevent the leading units of the Third Army from penetrating into the junction of German 4th and 9th Armies. As a result, the 2 armies lost contact with each other. After blunting the attack of the Soviet Third Army, General Jordan shifted the 20th Panzer Division south against Batov's 65th Army. However, the offensive power of the 20th Panzer Division was spent, and its counterattack against Batov was beaten back with heavy losses. Despite the best German efforts to halt the Soviet offensive, By June 27th, the X-Ly Panzer Corps and Hexi Corps became encircled around Bobruisk in a pocket roughly 20 miles in diameter. General Jordan requested permission for his units to break out, but the orders from Army Group Center were firm. The garrison of Fortress Bobruisk was told to fight on until the last man. Later that same day, General Lieutenant Edmund Hofmeister, the commandant at Bobruisk, sent a desperate radiogram to the Army Group Center headquarters. He reported no contact with the Executive Corps and chaos and panic in the city. On the evening of June 27th, the Red Army launched an assault against Bobruisk, with chaotic street fighting lasting through the night and into the next day. When Hitler finally permitted the breakout in the evening of the following day, it was too late. The few German units still capable of fighting ran into a double ring of blocking Soviet forces on the morning of June 29th. Led by a few remaining tanks from the 20th Panzer Division, the remnants of the XLI Panzer Corps punched through to link up with the General Major Gerhard Müller's 12th Panzer Division, fighting to reach them from the outside. Disorganized small groups of survivors from the Etixex Corps fought their way north to link up with the Fourth Army. By early July, 14,000 German survivors from the Ninth Army had reached the rapidly retreating German forces. The Germans had suffered approximately 80,000 casualties. While the Soviet command planned a rapid collapse of German flanks at Vitebsk and Bobruisk, the intent in the center at Mogilev was to pin down General Tippelskirch's Fourth Army to box it in. After punching through forward German defenses on June 23rd, the forces of the Second Belarus Front slowly pushed the Fourth Army due west. Despite heavy casualties, the Germans were able to organize a fighting retreat to the Second Defensive Line. Under remorseless Soviet pressure, the orderly pullback began to unravel into a disordered flight, with German units losing contact with each other. 4 days later, Tippelskirch gave orders over the radio for the general retreat to the Berezina River and Borisov. However, many units did not receive these orders, and those that did could not carry them out. Disorganized German units streamed west towards the Berezina River, hotly pursued by Soviet tanks and hammered by Soviet aircraft. The Red Army, pursuing the retreating Germans, fought their way across the Dnieper north and south of Mogilev. On June 28th, they captured the city by storm. Approximately 2,000 Germans in the city were rounded up and marched into captivity. The night of June 27th was spent in brutal street fighting, with the Germans launching desperate counterattacks in futile attempts to break out. By midday on June 28th, the troops of the Second Belarus Front had reached the center of Mogilev. German strongpoints were eliminated one by one, with the last organized German resistance being extinguished in the vicinity of the railroad station. To buy time for the remnants of his Fourth Army to reach the Berezina River, Tippelskirch cobbled together a Kampfgruppe, battle group, under the command of General Lieutenant Dietrich von Sauken. It consisted of the 5th Panzer Division, the 505th Heavy Panzer Battalion, a few military police companies, and an engineer training battalion. Von Sauken's men took up positions guarding the bridges in and near Borisov to cover the withdrawal of the Fourth Army. General der Panzertruppe Karl Decker's 5th Panzer Division was a powerful formation. As a result of a recent refitting, it was nearly at full strength. It boasted not only a battalion of 76 Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther medium tanks, but also 45 Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger heavy tanks of the 505th Heavy Tank Battalion. General Feldmarschall Walter Model, the newly appointed commander of Army Group Center, arrived on June 28th to take charge of the worsening situation. He established his headquarters at Lida, which was 100 miles west of Minsk. The headquarters staff lacked a clear picture of where the Army Group's extant units were located. With sporadic radio and telephone communications, contact between the Army Group headquarters and its units was maintained by sturdy Fieseler Storch aircraft. Reinforcements in the form of divisions that Hitler had released from reserves, either of the High Command or Army Group North, had been arriving since June 26th. The new reinforcements were fed into the fray just as the 5th and General Major Gerhard Müller's 12th Panzer Divisions had been before them. Soviet tanks reached the Berezina River at Borisov on June 29th. Russian combat engineers deployed several pontoon bridges, so that the rapidly advancing forces could continue their westward attack. Von Saucken's Kampfgruppe held on. In so doing, it bought time for the survivors of the February 7 and the 12th Corps to reach the new German front line. When Russian forces fought their way into Borisov the following day and clashed in the streets with German troops, von Saucken issued orders for his men to withdraw behind the Berezina River. Despite all odds, survivors from the destroyed units continued to trickle into German lines. With the Soviet forces fully in control of all available roads, the stragglers had to make their way west through forests teeming with vengeful partisans. Burning villages, guns and infantry fire, muffled explosions and detonations mixed in with the thundering hurrahs, recalled one German soldier who survived the campaign. Whoever fell out because of wounds or illness experienced the horrible fate of the abandoned. Marshes, rivers, thick forests, the heat of the sun, hunger, and lack of water had a terrible effect. What drove us on was the unshakable will to reach the German front. With the fall of Bobruisk and Vitebsk, both flanks of Army Group Center were shattered, and the road to Minsk was open from southeast and northwest. As the first phase of Operation Bagration was completed, Soviet forces briefly halted on the Berezina River to resupply, reorganize, and receive reinforcements. Success came at a great price, and many Soviet units had suffered significant losses. While their ground units halted, Soviet aircraft continued to attack the retreating Germans. The Soviet pilots flew nearly unopposed by the Luftwaffe. The short pause allowed Model to establish a new defensive line running north and south through the town of Molodechno and create some reserves from the arriving reserve divisions. Northwest of Minsk, the 5th Panzer Division made one more attempt to delay the inevitable. In the fighting on July 1st, too, the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army was gutted, but the 5th Panzer's combat power also was spent. It was down to 18 panzers. All of the 505th Heavy Tank Battalion's Tiger tanks were lost in the hard fighting. The vanguard of the Soviet 2nd Guards Tank Corps reached the northwestern outskirts of Minsk on July 2nd. At the same time, a Soviet mobile task force captured Nesvij, thereby cutting off German retreat toward Baranovichi. Before the trap closed, the Germans were able to evacuate 20,000 wounded and rear echelon troops from Minsk. The following morning, tanks from the 2nd Guards Tank Corps punched their way into Minsk from the northwest. German resistance collapsed rapidly, and by the end of the day, the capital of Belarus was liberated, a major political coup. Approximately 100,000 German soldiers were trapped in a large cauldron west of Minsk. With Tippelskirch outside the pocket, commander of the 12th Corps Müller took command of the encircled survivors of the 4th Army. Surrounded German troops were constantly being pounded by Soviet artillery and fighter bombers, steadily breaking up resistance into smaller and smaller pockets, which were mopped up by Soviet infantry. A group of several thousand German soldiers under General Hans Traut, commander of the 78th Sturm Division, was wiped out, and Traut himself captured on July 6th. Realizing that further resistance was impossible, 2 days later, Müller surrendered his forces southwest of Minsk. For the next several days, Soviet infantry and partisans combed the woods near Minsk, hunting down German stragglers. With Minsk taken, the 3rd Belarus Front received orders to take Lida and Vilno by the 12th of July and establish a beachhead on the west bank of the Niemen River. Vilno was a tough nut to crack. General Major Rainer Stachel's 12,000 Germans held strong positions in the fortress city. The 5th Guards Tank Army and the 3rd Guards Tank Corps bypassed Vilno on July 7th. They swung around from both the north and south. As the Soviet forces approached the city, an uprising by the underground Polish Home Army flared up in Vilno. The action was part of the efforts by Polish government in exile to establish a bargaining position after the defeat of Germany. While the military action was directed against the Germans, political aims were focused against the Soviets. The Polish government in exile located in London was hoping to position itself as an equal partner to resist Stalin's establishing political dominance over Poland after the war. German reinforcements arrived in Vilno during the night of July 7th. They were just in time, for the next morning leading infantry units from Soviet 5th Army began assaulting the city from southeast. Tanks from the 5th Guards Tank Army and the 3rd Guard Tank Corps linked up 2 days later just west of Vilnius, thus encircling the Germans inside the fortress city. Over the next 3 days, brutal street fighting raged. Assaults by Polish resistance fighters inside the city bedeviled the German defenders at the same time they were trying to fend off Soviet attacks from the outskirts. The Germans sold their lives dearly, and Soviet casualties were severe. German reinforcements desperately tried to reach their beleaguered comrades from the west. However, the Soviet ring around the city was constantly being reinforced, and all German efforts to relieve the trapped men failed. 2 German pockets of resistance remained in the western suburbs of Vilnius when Stalin gave orders to break out on July 12th. That night, the German 6th Panzer Division and part of Panzergrenadier Division Großdeutschland opened a corridor to the beleaguered German forces in Vilnius. Before the Soviets closed the gap, 3,000 Germans escaped, but the Germans lost 8,000 killed and 5,000 captured in the final Russian assault on the city. The Soviets established bridgeheads on the west bank of Neman River on July 15th. For the next few days, the Germans made desperate counterattacks in the hope of dislodging the Russians. Despite best German efforts, the Red Army units maintained their positions and even expanded them. By that point, the German territory of East Prussia was within striking distance. Once the city was firmly in Soviet hands, NKVD internal security units began disarming and interning Polish Home Army fighters, forcing those who escaped the dragnets back underground. This action clearly demonstrated to the Polish government in exile that Stalin was not going to acknowledge them as equal partners or to allow armed formations, inherently hostile to the Soviets, to remain behind the front lines. While the Soviet offensive continued unstoppably, the Germans were still capable in some instances of inflicting punishing losses on the Russians. For example, Major General Philip Rudkin's 11th Tank Corps advanced on the left flank of the 1st Belarus front without conducting reconnaissance. The Tank Corps ran headlong into well-entrenched German anti-tank positions 2 miles south of Kovel. In the ensuing fighting, the Tank Corps lost 84 tanks. Stavka subsequently removed Rudkin from command. In order to demonstrate to the world the success of the summer offensive, Stalin ordered a prisoner parade to be conducted in Moscow. 57,000 German prisoners captured at Minsk were transported to Moscow, and on the 17th of July, marched in 2 giant columns through the city center. The prisoner columns were followed by street sweeper trucks, symbolically cleansing the ground of the so-called Nazi filth. The border city of Brest was liberated on July 21st, and the Red Army entered Polish territory, taking Lublin on July 24th. When Soviet forces reached Lublin, they liberated Majdanek, the first concentration camp encountered by the Red Army. In a cruel twist of fate, once the liberated prisoners were moved out, the victorious Red Army detained members of the Polish Home Army at Majdanek. As the Red Army approached Warsaw on August 1st, elements of the Polish Home Army rose up against the Germans again. Although the Warsaw Uprising lasted 63 days, the Allies took no action other than to airdrop some supplies. As for the Red Army, it halted at the city's eastern suburbs and stood passively by while the Germans slaughtered the resistance forces. Elsewhere on the Eastern Front, Soviet forces steadily advanced throughout August. They succeeded in liberating Belarus, parts of the Baltic states, and eastern Poland. On August 28th, the Red Army shifted temporarily to the defensive. That move marked the end of Operation Bagration. Model was unable to prevent the destruction of Army Group Center. Of its 38 divisions, 28 were lost in the savage fighting between June and August. Official German losses were cited as 26,000 killed, 110,000 wounded, and 263,000 captured or missing. Yet a large percentage of German troops missing in action were actually killed. German headquarters frequently designated entire units as missing when their fate was unknown. As for the Red Army, it suffered 178,000 killed, missing, or captured, and another 587,000 wounded. These were extremely heavy losses for a victorious side. Operation Bagration heralded the certainty of German defeat, leading to Allied hopes of ending the war in 1944. Bagration was one of the largest offensives conducted by the Soviet Union during the war, but the Germans fought on. With defeat all but certain, they continued to fight brilliantly to the bitter end. Commanders such as General Oberst Gotthard Heinrici, who slowed the Soviet advance on Berlin at Seelow Heights in mid-April 1945, helped prolong the war in Europe. After Hitler died on April 30th, General Oberst Alfred Jodl, representing the German High Command, traveled to Reims, France, where he signed Germany's unconditional surrender on May 7th. The surrender became effective the following day and was celebrated as Victory in Europe Day.